So, Josh, there's gonna be people watching this who have no idea who you are.
Sure.
So, how would you describe yourself and what you do?
So I've worked in basically startups my entire career. So I'm a startup guy, early phase companies. I've learned my chops. I had to be a literally down in the dirt programmer doing computer programming, building interfaces, right up to project management, to working in marketing and doing a variety of different things. And I've worked my way up to be as I've told you before, a product manager, which kind of gives you a lot of accountability and responsibility about the strategy, the shape and design of what you build. And of course, working very closely with engineers, computer science engineers, who actually program the things that I, determine are the problems that we need to solve. So I've been doing that for pretty much my entire career. Always a bunch of small players, but some of them have paid off. The big bet is you work for a small company, it grows, you get the nice equity play, and you go from there. But that's kind of me in a nutshell: is software product management, software engineering and design, and then kind of landed me where I am today. And I'm in the insurance industry now, but I've worked in a variety of different industries. I've worked in e-commerce. When it first came out, the first thing I was in the dot-com boom for online grocery delivery. So you literally buy your groceries online, and we would ship that out. Went into fashion tech, which was merchandising and sales there. And then went into social ad tech, which was Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all their ad platforms, and working for basically on Madison Avenue for ad agencies, doing a lot of that work, but again, very technically minded. And now I'm in insurance. So, the domain that I'm in can change, but what I do, my skill set is transferable to pretty much any industry. And that's kind of how I've found some success and been able to kind of position myself at these smaller companies, early stage. And of course, trying to bet on those big wins, is what I've been kind of trying to do with my entire career. So some of them don't work so well. Most of them have gone out of business or, lost funding or, kind of died on the vine. But some have actually gone up. And one company, we were bought by one company, and that company went public. So, they do pay off every now and then, but they don't pay off all the time. And it's a high risk, high reward kind of thing. Versus, what most people do when they just get a job, work 9 to 5 for, 30 years of their lives. They're usually safer and there's not much upside, but, they have that reliability. Startups can go out of business at any point in time. So you got to be able to deal with that, that anxiety and that risk in terms of that. So that's kind of the nature of where I am and what my career looks like and what I've been doing, since the last 25 years, basically. So makes sense.
Yeah. So, a startup, just to make sure I have it.
Yep.
A startup is any company that just started.
Exactly.
Right.
Usually, startups are usually defined by, they either have a founder and the founder's got an idea. So they figured out that there's a problem in whatever market. It could be in tires. They just go, there's a problem in tires, and they're going to figure out a way to build a better tire and design that. So they're an early stage company. They generally rely on early stage investment. So that can be angel investors. Most of the companies I've worked at have received some sort of venture capital. So VCs will come in and go, we like your idea. We see that you've got some growth. They'll throw in, a couple $1,000,000 to get a big piece or part of that pie, but they end up throwing a lot of fuel on the fire so that company can grow very quickly and start to command and take over more of the market. So early stage, but yeah, it doesn't. A startup does not have to be in technology. I think you'll find more often a lot of technology companies, they're more defined. Like when you say a startup, most people think software, they think technology. But it can be hardware, it could be software, it could be anything along those lines. But yeah, that's definitely traditionally a startup.
Okay. So, how do you find these startups?
Yeah. They find me. So,
Okay.
it's my first job was really just kind of, I didn't, when I got my first job at NetGrosser, it was the first .com boom. So this is probably well before your time, but these were the days when, kind of the first fury of just the internet came around, e-commerce was starting to come into play. I didn't know, really a lick of difference between any of these companies and what these companies were doing. I just happened to have a particular skill set. I was doing some web design, kind of akin to what you were doing with your photography. Like, it was early stage. I had a small portfolio of some side projects I had done for free and things like that. And they just needed somebody who was visual, who could put stuff together, because they were working with major consumer package good companies like Kraft and Johnson & Johnson, things like that, to build these branded sites. And they said, you're a perfect fix because you can program the code and you can design these pages. That's what we need. And they found me, and that just kind of started the career off. That company failed spectacularly. I mean, we ended up being funded by a company out of Italy, and then that company went bankrupt because it was like Italy's Enron. It was like a terrible fallout. And we were just, the gum on the bottom of their shoe, and they put us out of business after being there for 3 years, So it was a perfect example of like, wow, this can just really get the rug pulled out from under you. Nothing we've done wrong ourselves. We had a good little business we were operating, but we weren't profitable, and we were relying on that investment. And then when the investment soured and disappeared, we just went the way of the dodo. But then it just ended up translating into other startups that were looking for, people who are scrappy, people that have decent skill sets, people that just fit in what they need, because they're usually very tactical in what they need, because they're in a very specific stage of growth in their company. So they've really got to have somebody that knows this one thing very, very well, and they tend to search and find those people because they're very strategic hires. And one of the reasons they'll get investment is usually to hire people. So, they'll raise $15 million in a B round or a C round from a venture capital, and it's primarily to hire salespeople, product people, design people, so they can build their things faster. It's all an accelerator, right? So you got enough of an idea, you showed enough organic growth, but to really make it happen and position yourself with the big boys, you need a little bit of money, you need a little bit of people and capital to kind of get that going. So usually what ends up happening is because I do early stage, and I'm now have a kind of a strong career of working with startups, that at the end of the day I look very good because people go, wow, we need somebody who knows startups, understands what the culture is going to be like, understands the challenges, is flexible. Some people are not very flexible. Some people just want a job, they show up, they do their day-to-day, they clock in 9 to 5. Startups aren't like that. You have to understand, you guys are kind of doing it yourselves. You're almost your own startup, in a lot of ways. You gotta sweep up the dirt sometimes, and you gotta put things away, and you gotta do things that aren't in your job description because it's actually important to do. So that's an advantage because I've been around for a long time. So even though I'm a more seasoned kind of manager and leader, I still have done and worked in startups for years and years. So at the end of the day, people go, he's got the culture, because it really is kind of a special niche and a special type of person that has to kind of work at a startup. They take a lot of gumption and a lot of effort.
So maybe when you first started in startups, you didn't have the skills that you have now. Right. So what are some of the skills that you've developed as a byproduct of working in startups that a 9 to 5 didn't teach you?
Before we get back into the podcast, please just give me 30 seconds of your time. I only have one favor that I want to ask of you, and if you're on Spotify, please follow this show and give it a rating of whatever you think I deserve. If you're listening on YouTube, subscribe and share this with a friend. And by doing those things, it will push my podcast out to more people, and I can impact more lives with your help. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I wouldn't be doing it without you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the one thing that you'll see in most 9 to 5s, most big companies, quote unquote big companies, is structure, right? They'll bring you in, they train you on exactly how to do everything. There's a manual for everything. There's a policy and a procedure, and somebody to help enforce that policy and procedure. Some people just have jobs whose job is to enforce other people's jobs and how they do it. That's why it's a big company, right? And has all that bureaucracy. In startups, there's no playbook. You have to be, and I've told this to you in the past, and it's something that I kind of consider a bit of a personal mantra that's allowed me to be successful. You have to be fearless in the face of ambiguity. If my CEO came to me and said, that's it, tomorrow we got to start building rocket ships, I'd go, okay, I don't know anything about rocket ships, but I sure shit could probably figure out a little bit and start to get the right people together and start ask the right questions about what might need to be done to build a rocket ship. But I can't just sit there and go, I can't do that, see you later. You have to kind of take it in stride and go, this is going to be a challenge. This is going to be something I don't understand. This is going to be something that, is going to push my boundaries. And you have to kind of just generally be pretty comfortable with that. And being in these spaces for these startups where at the end of the day, you just don't know whether or not you're going to get a paycheck in 3 months. And we had that with my first company. You just have to kind of, you have to roll with the flow a little bit. Some people just really don't like doing that. It's a very high risk, kind of situation, and it scares them a little bit. So let's see if we can get back over here. This guy's doing
wow,
a little tight. No. But so that's one of the bigger things that I've learned there. So it's a lot of flexibility, a lot of skill, and the other thing that I think startups really teach you, which is really nice about it, is that it's you're a big fish in a little pond. So, which makes things pretty key when it comes down to forming your own leadership skills and understanding what it takes to actually do something. You have to kind of lead by example, because there's no one else to do it. You can't just say, well, I'm going to have these 15 people go do something for me. You don't have 15 people. You probably sometimes work in a department of 1 or 2. At the end of the day, you've got to step up and make that happen. And I think for me in particular, maybe because I had a little natural affinity toward it, but being in startups just really enhanced those leadership abilities, the show me, don't tell me, just to go out and get it done. And by being able to do that and showing all of that, it really, was something I was able to foster and grow in myself. And I think has led me to be, kind of successful in my career overall. And I'm think, in larger companies, and this isn't always true, but in larger companies, you tend to be a little cocooned by all the support around you. You may not be pushed to those kind of uncomfortable edges like you would if you're working in a startup. So I think that's one of the things that kind of suited me pretty well, and definitely something that, taught me quite a bit. So definitely, fearlessness in the face of ambiguity. Just throw anything at me, I'll figure it out. I know there's things I don't know. I know there's things I couldn't even begin to know. But I'm pretty confident I could find people that would know how to do that and figure out how to solve the problem, coordinate and get people together to answer questions or ask more questions. That's the important part of driving something forward. Usually it's pretty much what my job is. So in which case, those are big things that I've learned from doing startup stuff for sure, and formed a good basis of who I am today.
Say there's somebody out there who was almost like me, listening to podcasts while I did dishes.
Yep.
What, if you're not in that startup space, if you're in the 9 to 5, how do you curate, or what skills can you use in the 9 to 5 that'll help develop skills for a startup or for a different kind of environment?
That's a trickier question, because that can be a little tough. I have seen some people who have come over from the 9 to 5s, because a lot of times some startups are pretty sexy, right? You start looking at them and go, wow, there's a lot of money in this space, and there's some good money for some, good careers. So you'll get some people, for instance, even at Net Grocer, my very first job, we had a lot of Johnson & Johnson people. Johnson & Johnson's a massive company. I mean, they're huge beyond huge, and they came over. Now, the nice thing is that they were hired also because they brought some discipline. You don't want to be running around like chickens with your heads cut off, which is what a lot of startups feel like most of the time. Sometimes you do need an adult in the room, and sometimes those people actually can offer that. So if there are people that are 9 to 5ers that are saying, hey, I do want something that's a little more flexible, I want a little more responsibility and ownership over what I'm doing, I don't want all the bureaucracy and the red tape, there are advantages to coming to a startup from that type of culture, because you will actually bring a little more stability, in your general mindset and how you approach things. So that's an easy way for people to kind of, break into startups. In terms of learning the skills and kind of being able to deal with it, it's just like changing any job, right? If I'm in the fashion industry and I want to become, something in whatever advertising, that's a big jump. You're going to take a bit of a step back. There's things you're going to have to learn. There's things you're going to have to kind of do on the side. Maybe it's a little bit of a side hustle or something along those lines. But that's where things get a little trickier and a little harder. But it's not to say that if you're not doing the 9 to 5, you can't break into the startups, because by having some of those skill sets, you can actually do pretty well, because those skill sets are also needed. We're not just hiring people that are shooting from the hip every day. You need people that have some financial discipline. You need people that have some, marketing discipline. You need people with discipline within their collective domains to start to move things forward as the company grows and gets more and more stable and does all of that. So, that makes sense.
Yeah. How? Because obviously it's a stressful environment.
Yeah.
It's easier to plug in the AirPods and do the dishes, but if you take it a step further, you're in the startup, you're in whatever that looks like.
Yep.
Now you're not capped.
Yep.
No matter how hard I worked, I was capped in my hourly with my dishes.
Yep.
And you reap the benefits of that now.
Yep. No, 100%. Yeah, I mean, that's one of that I learned also very early on. Like, that was one of the things that I was rewarded very quickly, especially at Net Grocer. I would receive, bonuses. They could see you going above and beyond, because it's there's a great euphemism, and I'm gonna forget it, but there's some people hide, the blade of grass that sticks up above is the one that gets its head cut off. But in a startup, that's actually the preferred. You want to be the visibility. You have to be the thing that's going to drive the force and make the change and hit the goals, because the goals are so important to hit. If you don't hit them, your company's literally gonna dry up and kind of go out. So in a lot of ways, it's you kind of get the instant reward, the instant accolades. Your friends and your coworkers will note very well. You'll tend to see a strong culture of reward in startups. People will often, as they're doing things, just go, one company I worked at was Grubhub. They had this like cupcake culture, and they used to just buy each other cupcakes when they did a great job. Like you did an awesome job on that project, and everyone would buy them a cupcake, and that was their thing. So I don't think you see that in large corporate environments and things like that, but in startups, people recognize when people are putting in big effort like that, and when they're performing and when they're going above and beyond. And while it's stressful, there's also just the very strong, encouraging, and usually very natural kind of culture that kind of comes out of that. And that was something that I saw and immediately liked as well too, because it feels good. It's part of the outcomes that I think you're looking for in life is the professional accolades, the friendships, and the things you build there. So which is always important too. So and you don't not saying you don't get that in large companies. They do their best to try to create those cultures. I doubt they're as organic as you might find in like a startup, because you're kind of forced to survive, and it is high stress. So people need to they got to tune it down every now and then and relax a little bit, and it's got to be something that's enjoyable and fun to do. So there's that balance that people just naturally gravitate to, even if they're high performers. So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I want to hit on something there. During my last little bit doing dishes, I was huge on integrity. Nobody is gonna watch, or nobody's gonna know if I miss this one thing on the plate, but I will. Yep. Nobody's gonna know that I washed every single nook and cranny of this floor, but I will know. And Josh, I don't need a cupcake to do that.
Yeah.
So is not necessarily a bad thing, but does that cupcake? Because only now that you're getting a cupcake are you going to work hard.
Oh no, I don't. I don't think it's that. I didn't mean to portray it as that. It's more of a I think in let's elevate it up to most professional environments, right? Most professional environments are highly collaborative. They're voluntary, but they're also a little cutthroat. I'm working for my job, trying to get my promotion. You're trying to work for your job, get your promotion. We may be competing for things, and it's tough, And in startups, because you're smaller and the lines of ownership can be a little blurrier, that happens a little more often. The cupcake example is more of just how people cope with that fact that it's so highly competitive and in kind of high energy and high intensity. It's just a nice thing that they do. It's not necessarily like people don't do work because they want the cupcake, but they do recognize that people do work hard, and it's just nice to receive those accolades. So I don't think it's necessarily like people only do it for the cupcake type of thing. It's just more of it creates the balance to this high stress environment that you're in, to realize at the end of the day that people are actually working for you. You are still a team. You're trying to achieve the same thing together. You think of it the same way. If you're a dishwasher, how many times or how often do you get a pat on the back or something from a server or somebody in the front, like, hey man, thanks for doing what you're doing? I doubt it ever happened. I don't know, but does it? Wouldn't it have felt a lot better if a server was like, hey man, thanks for everything you do? Just to feel good. You know that you would know in your heart that because you did what you did, and because you are paying attention to every scrap and every piece, that was recognized. It was something that was there. I think that's important for the human condition in general, to make sure that we know that we're on the right track. How else do we know that what we're doing is good and actually right, unless we're receiving a little positive feedback on things. So the positive feedback is important, but I don't think in any way that it's the only reason people did a good job is because they got the cupcake. It's just a matter of like an example of how the cultures kind of come together, and people compensate for the fact that they're in this high stress, high work environment with a lot of responsibility, a lot of accountability. They have to make sure each other are well taken care of, and they're thinking about each other, and kind of caring for each other a little bit. So that's the only reason I mean by that. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
So you talked earlier about being the tallest blade of grass, the person that stands out. From what you've seen, or even from yourself, what are those key things that somebody who's a big blade of grass has that somebody else who's a small blade of grass doesn't have?
I think it's basically some risk tolerance, right? You've got to be able to basically make a bet, and that's one thing that I've also leaned on a lot in my career. I'm not afraid to make bets on very limited information. Some people are just completely risk averse. They just go, I will not do something unless I have all my I's dotted, all my T's crossed. I have to talk to this person for the third time to confirm they really mean what they really mean. I need to go ask another customer another thing, versus at some point you just have to kind of say, look, at the end of the day, I don't know, and I'm not sure I can ever really know exactly what the answer is going to be. But I'm going to take this bet because I'm going to stand behind it. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it'll ultimately lead to some success. You have to believe in your strategy. But I think that that risk-taking nature is the type of thing that you'll see. Those taller blades of grass are the people that are willing to make the bigger bets and take those bigger risks. And sometimes some cultures, even in the insurance culture, for instance, because insurance is incredibly risk averse. Being super risky in insurance is actually looked down upon, right? So they're the ones that get their heads cut off. But in startups, fortune favors the bold kind of thing. You need to be able to stand out. You need to be able to make the case for what you're going to do. You need to be able to make cases for things without sometimes a lot of great information. You want some information. You always want data, but sometimes it's just not available. And sometimes you get into this analysis paralysis, which usually frustrates me with a lot of people. Is you just go, well, we're not going to make a decision on this for another 4 weeks because we've got to have 16 more rounds of questions. It's like, I think we're in a pretty good spot. We should probably just move forward. We're going to do a lot better if we build something simply and test it in the market than we will if we just ask 15 more questions again. Now, that's management style, that's leadership style, that's things like that get a little, some companies thrive on that, some companies don't. But what I find is generally startups tend to thrive on the people that are willing to make those bets and put them out there. But your bets can lose. That's the problem. You don't always win when you place a bet. So, and that's pretty much the case with a lot of startups. And I think why I see a lot of startups go belly up at the end of the day. You just got an owner or a founder who's willing to make some bets and execute on it, and sometimes it just doesn't pay off. So, but those are the things and characteristics of people that tend to be able those blades of grass that stick their head up. So they're going to do it anyway. So if they do it in a culture where it's not rewarded, they're going to leave that culture and they're going to go find a culture where it is good. And that's why I think you'll see people gravitated towards startups, because they're the people who are willing to take bets. They're willing to take bets with their career, with their families, with their, they're looking for the payoff, all of that. So at the end of the day, they're the type of people that you're going to see, and they tend to gravitate toward the higher risk situations, also the higher growth situations, to be perfectly honest, as well too. So, just a good example of that. But
Josh, you said earlier that in your field, being risky is frowned upon.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, in the field that I'm in now, because I sell software to insurance, risk means going out of business. So if an insurance company insures you or insures me for this car, right, and they think I'm some yahoo, and I go driving at 1,000,000 miles an hour and crash into 15 other cars, and make a claim, that's going to be very, very expensive, right? So that's risk, right? We don't know what this jerk is going to do with this high power car, right? And insurance companies, when they have to pay those claims out, it costs them money, right? That's against their bottom lines, and they don't like that at all. So this is the first time from a startup perspective. It's a really weird, for me, really odd juxtaposition, because startups themselves are aggressive, fast-moving, risk-taking entities, and yet we sell to the slowest, stodgiest, most risk-averse industry under the sun. So there's a lot of, which requires, and to credit of the CEO that I work for, requires a lot of stewardship and careful navigation in terms of how we stay funded, how much our operations are profitable, and what we have to do, which a normal startup wouldn't necessarily worry about. A normal startup would just be go, got $30 million, hire 5 salespeople, sell. It's a balls to the wall kind of, get out there, make it happen type thing. But in insurance, because you're dealing with such an old industry that is so risk averse itself, it's in its nature. It doesn't like risk. Its insurance job is to manage risk. So they know risk inside and out. They don't move quickly. They move very slowly. They move the exact point. They'll have the 16 meetings, asking the 16 questions every time, repeating the same questions to make sure they get the same answers. It's a lot of repetitive carefulness that they take from an approach perspective. So it's a really, really tough for me, because I tend to work so quickly and so off the cuff, that I've had to be a little bit more diligent and a little more careful. And I capitalize on the people around me who have worked in the insurance industry, and I kind of watch what they do, because they know how to handle and talk to these people, and they know how to basically slowly massage and move things forward, even though it feels like everything's moving at a glacial pace. Because insurance is just very, very slow. But at the end of the day, insurance knows what they do is still kind of old school. They know that there are better ways to do things, and they know that technology can help them. So they're also torn a little bit as well, and they know technology moves quickly, and they have to test it, and they're not going to get, when you're testing things, some things are going to work and some things aren't, but they still try to mitigate that risk. So it makes for a very insurtech, unlike social ad tech. Social ad tech was like the Wild West. Insurtech is like, the old parlor room with people sitting around listening to the piano playing and just sipping their tea. You know, it's a very staid environment, very, very kind of chill, very like, well, we'll consider that. You know, we want to move really quickly, so we'll talk to you next year. And you're like, really quickly next year? You know, we'll build this next week. You know, like we're kind of in that mindset. So that's the thing that's really kind of tough in the current industry. I mean, that's been the biggest adjustment that I've had to get used to as a startup in insurance, to just wildly different approaches to business and to risk handling and risk aversion. It makes things really, really complicated.
I mean, I think you just hit it on the nail on the head there, but it's two polar opposites. You love risk, you want to get this done now, but then insurance is like, no, we gotta another team meeting, gotta do this, gotta do that.
Pump the brakes, bro. You know, like take it easy. You know, they've been around for a very long time. They command billions of dollars of premium. You know, they just don't want anything to throw that off, at risk. And the way insurance companies are actually structured, which is pretty interesting, and I didn't realize until I got into this industry, even from an accounting perspective, insurance companies, from their accounting basis, assume they're going to go out of business every year. That's how they run their accounting. It's an actual accounting style that plans on them going out of business. Now, they don't go out of business, but they have to assume that all of the risks they have on their book, every insurance policy will come in and make a claim and wipe them out, because that's how they have to operate to try to stay financially solvent. So the money that they do have, they have to be very protective of and be very, very careful of it. That's not how standard companies do their accounting. Most companies do it from a growth perspective. You know, like, I'm making $100 million. Well, I'll make $200 million. I'm going to do my accounting based on that. Insurance companies can't do that because they can't assume that they're going to have more money tomorrow than they do today, because they have all this outstanding risk on all these policies that could come in at any moment and take their money away. So they have to hedge it, be far more careful and cautious around all of that. So it's really, it is their DNA to manage risk 100%, really manage everything related to risk. They are just risk monsters. They just know how to handle it. They beat it up and they just put it in a box, and they know exactly what it is and they know exactly how to handle it. It's a real art, to be honest. It's pretty impressive, but it does handicap you when you're trying to move fast and make decisions, because you're just one more thing and one more thing and one more thing, and we go through that with contract negotiations, we go through that with our demonstrations, we go through it with everything, and rightly so, because they do have to be very, very cautious about their operations and what they're doing.
So just to be clear, insurance companies always think worst case scenario, as if every single claim is going to be filed, whatever that looks like.
Yep.
Wow.
If you've got a policy, they basically have to assume that policy is, if they charge you, let's say, $5,000 for your policy, they assume that every policy is going to cost them $20,000. Like, they have to think about that. They hope it doesn't. They try to pick risks that they think are going to be okay. They don't insure the Yahoo, that's going to drive off and crash the car, but they almost have to assume that financially, because you're literally writing a contract that puts them on the hook to pay those things. So when you have a contract with somebody, if something happens, you technically have to pay it. Now, you can fight it in court and things like that. Of course, they do that, but that's expensive. So, at the end of the day, they have to be very protective of what they've done, because they're writing checks that haven't been cashed yet. They're putting them out into the world, hoping no one cashes the check. That's the claim, So, and they get to pocket whatever's left over. So it is risk. I mean, that's what insurance is managing risk effectively. So
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a tough industry, but it's profitable. They do well. It's a science. I mean, there's data scientists and actuaries that work on this stuff, and they find every nuance. I mean, they will, they can figure out everything about you, from, the way you wear your glasses to your age, demographics and things like that. They know exactly how likely you are to make these claims based on what you do and where you live and all this other thing. So, which is why it's also ripe for discrimination, which is why it's also extremely heavily regulated as well. So in addition to being totally risk averse, they can't discriminate in any way, and there's heavy regulation around that. So there's tons and tons of compliance. So every time they write a policy, they have to basically prove that they did not give a price in a discriminatory manner. They didn't pick you because you're young and jack up the price. They didn't pick you because you're white or black and give you bad pricing, because that's illegal in the United States. It's not illegal in other places, but it is illegal in the United States. And they have to basically prove that from a compliance perspective. So there's a lot of overhead and cost to that as well. And failure to do that can run a lot of risk for them as well, because then the government's breathing down their neck, and they could lose their business just for that alone too. So it's coming at them from all angles. It's not an easy business by any means, in terms of what they have to do and what they're trying to accomplish there. A lot of overhead, high risk, managing risk, and then all the compliance and regulation around it, which in the United States is very, very high compared to other countries. And it's really a big deal. So a big part of what when we sell our software, it has to fit all of that. We have to build software that fits their compliance, because now we're a third party. What if our system is, accidentally making mistakes? You've seen this. We use AI, and Microsoft famously put out that one AI chatbot, and people made it racist like within like 10 hours. It's like these things are not infallible. The last thing you need is some service like ours running that had some AI behind it, and all of a sudden the AI is making some biased decision about whether to select or do risk. Well, that's illegal. You can't do that. So they need all of that. They need all of that compliance to prove how the decisions were made. And it gets really, really tricky, really, really fine there. They have to be very, very careful about that, because the surface area is so big for them when it comes to that type of risk as well. So big stuff there.
So you just said there that if I charge this person more because they do X, Y, or Z, that's illegal. But
you can't do it based on protected characteristics. You can't do it based on race, gender, age, things along those lines. You can do it if you buy an expensive car. Like, you can go, well, you're buying an expensive car with high horsepower. We're betting you're going to race it around. We're betting you're going to do all sorts of nasty stuff. Your insurance premiums are going to be higher. But they can't do it because I'm a man, or because I'm young, or because I'm black. They can't do it according to the Civil Rights Act. They can't do it according to those protected classes. If you do that, that's highly illegal. So they are able to charge different prices for different things. If you buy a house in a floodplain, you're going to pay more for insurance because you're in a floodplain. But that's not related to you as a person. It's related to the characteristics of the risk. They're allowed to do that, but and of course they have to do that because that's the basis of how they understand how to price things to cover enough money. But at the end of the day, they can't discriminate against people. You don't want it to turn into like, well, we'll take all these young kids and we won't give them any insurance. Well, that's not really fair. We'll take all these old people who are gonna die, and we won't give them insurance. No, you can't do that. That's illegal in the United States. In our legal system, that's illegal. So again, not all countries do that. So one of the perks of being in the United States is that protection, right?
Yeah, one of many.
Yeah.
I guess it's like, how do you? Because if I just charge like a few dollars more, a few $100s more, how does that not go under the radar? How do you find that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, but they have to log every single decision. So everything they do in all of their computer systems and all their computer software has to track and record every decision that's been done. Now, of course, what ends up happening is that if somebody suspects that there was some sort of basis of discrimination, they would log a lawsuit. And if the insurance company can't provide proof that they effectively wrote other risks the exact same way, regardless of that characteristic, if they can't prove that, then it would be a sign or signal that there might have been something discriminatory. So that's why they have to have all this compliance and keep every record, every piece of everything they need to do. And as a matter of fact, us as a vendor, we receive their information and we interpret a lot of it. We have to actually kind of provide receipts to their compliance system. So we touched this document. These are the fields that we extrapolated. Here's the logic that we applied. Here's the rules that we applied. This was the version of those rules. Everything has to be very, very tightly kept together so that you know exactly what was going on at the point in time that a decision was made. Now, they don't have to actively report it, but if somebody were to say, gee, I think you gave me a high rate because I'm this or that, the insurance company would have to say, no, we did this for everybody of this characteristic. It wasn't related to your protected class. It was related to the fact that everyone with a red car, gets into a crash more, 5 times more likely than somebody with a white car. And that's the reason you got a higher price. They have to be able to prove that at every instance. So that's how they do it. But yeah, it requires a massive amount of detail and data. And they have entire teams of people that just work for compliance. So, and then we have to interface with those people and make sure we provide them with receipts for their chain of custody so they know exactly what happened. So it's a big feature that I have to manage as it's relative to our product to make sure that what we did, what we touched, and how we do it is easily reportable so they can ingest that, put it into their system, and their compliance people go, good, I know exactly what happened over here, I know what happened over here, and then I know how Joe came up with $5,000. Now I know, and it's all good to go.
Is there any other things that you've learned being in the insurance space that you went like, oh, I had no idea, like X, Y, and Z?
It's interesting. There's funny stuff that occurs in insurance that's really, really weird. I was just talking to my other product manager who used to be an underwriter, and she saw a submission because we were examining some data for a customer for some new requirements, and it was actually an account that she used to underwrite. So she actually knew the business. It was a stadium that did events and everything, and she said it was really funny because one time they sent in they wanted to set up a small insurance policy because they were going to do a special event. So, anytime you have an event like a wedding or anything like that, there's actually a piece of insurance on that, right? In case somebody slips and falls or does whatever. And she said the thing is that they sent in the application for an event that had already taken place, which an insurance company would never, they're not going to backdate insurance. And the event was basically people in the stands throwing baseballs at somebody who was taped to a wall. And she's like, there's no way we would insure. This is just crazy. Like, why would they even think this is something we would even consider? And they were like, yeah, we just, we need insurance for this event and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, first of all, it already happened. And two, we're not going to insure like people throwing baseballs at somebody who's taped to a wall. Like the guy's going to get hurt. Like, this is just crazy. Like, it's just that. So you hear all sorts of like weird stories like that of just like random stuff. One guy was another underwriter was at a trade show and he was talking. He's like, my greatest save, because underwriters basically worry about those claims because they're really responsible for that. So if they pick you as a risk and all of a sudden you cost them a lot of money, that's their job on the line. So this one guy said he was looking at a company, this very normal company. Everything was fine, but they were having trouble getting insurance from other companies, and he thought that was really strange. So he dug a little bit and he looked around and he saw that there was a naval depot down the street at the end of the block. So he called the naval depot and he said, hey, what type of things do you store in your depot? And they're like, oh, munitions and stuff like that. And he was like, oh, do you have enough like explosives and things like that could damage a building? And the guy was like, yeah, we can take out the entire block here. He's like, bingo, that's why they're having a hard time getting insured, because down the street there's literally a Navy munitions loaded with ammunition that could take out the entire block, and the business was a block away. And it's like, okay, you got to take that into consideration. But he had to do this like diligence to like, the extra phone call to like try to figure out what was going on, to be like, why are these guys having such a hard time getting covered? Because they didn't disclose that information. They're just like, yeah, we're just a flower shop, doing whatever. Well, you're a flower shop down the street from a place that stores, rockets and bombs. Like, it's kind of like you're a very risky flower shop to insure. So little funny stuff like that I hear all the time in terms of, anecdotal stuff. But bigger stories, the insurance industry is it's monolithic, it's big. I never really understood insurance before. I paid car insurance and stuff like that, and knew you have to have it. So I do what was the prerequisite, and do all that stuff. But at the end of the day, there's a lot more that goes into it, and there's a lot of government oversight and government regulation as well too. So it's a tricky industry, and again, it's very different in the U.S. versus other countries, because other countries they really don't worry about discrimination the way that we do. They're just like, too bad, we just don't like this, so we're just not going to underwrite it, or we'll make the price so exorbitantly high you can't afford it. And you really can't do that in the United States. They really protect against that in a big way. So
you keep hitting on it's different in the U.S. than it is in other countries.
Yep.
What's something that fascinates you about other countries that we don't do, or maybe the other way around?
I think I find what's interesting too is if you look at the current political climate and people are just going, oh, America's so bad and it's so evil, and you just go, I work in an insurance industry that is so heavily regulated, so they can't have a whiff of discrimination. They can't even be thinking of making bad decisions based on these protected classes, and yet there are other countries where they just could care less. They just go, we just don't like this neighborhood, we don't like this region, we don't like these people, we'll charge whatever price we want, and they just do it. And it's really kind of shocking that people don't understand how well protected we are because of our kind of very Western liberal system. And I don't want to get too overly political or anything, but at the end of the day, I find it interesting when people I don't think people know this, and I don't think it's this thing of insurance and go, well, who cares? Well, insurance is a big deal when you're trying to start a business. If you're trying to start a business and you can't get insurance, starting a business is one of the best ways to change your station in life. That you want to go from poor to middle class or middle class to rich, start your own business. But if you can't insure it, if the insurance is too expensive, it's an immediate way to hold people down. You can use that as a form of discrimination to really treat people poorly. And at the end of the day, you can't do that in the United States. It's really illegal. If an insurance company was caught or even, like I said, had a whiff of discrimination, the government will come down so hard on them and put them out of business. It just cannot happen. And we kind of take for granted some of these liberties that we have and some of these protections in our system because we live in a Western liberal system that just does not exist in the rest of the world. Even in places in Europe, they don't really have these types of protections, and nowhere near the extent that we do in the United States. So it's kind of interesting when I hear things like that, and then I see it working every day, where I know that these industries, which are billions and billions of dollars, you would think, well, it's just really easy for them to just layer in discrimination or hurt people. It really isn't. It's really very difficult for them to do because, again, all you need is a whiff of it and a lawsuit, and if they can't prove it, they're dead in the water. They're really in bad shape. So it's really one of those things that I find surprising, kind of thinking about that. But one of the things that I learned from insurance, because I just went, wait a minute, this is really kind of how our system is designed to work to really protect people. It is actually pretty interesting in terms of what it does there. So, yeah.
On a similar note of, we don't really understand how blessed we are. If you go to, I don't know, like Ecuador, Africa, and these little kids are kicking around a little like empty water bottle like it's soccer, and then they have smiles on their faces. They're so happy. But Josh, we get upset when our Apple CarPlay doesn't connect.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a perspective. Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, it comes with wealth, right? I mean, the United States and we as American citizens, I mean, even people who are at or near the poverty levels in the United States are still wealthier than like 90% of the rest of the world. I mean, it's, like when you really look at the grand scale, Americans are just so wealthy, and wealth begets and kind of creates a little bit of complacency and a little laziness, to be honest, too. So I think we suffer from that culturally. I think social media has been pretty interesting because it also tends to feed the narcissism and tends to feed that lackadaisical nature, and people, it just amplifies all that kind of poor behavior in a lot of ways too. So one of the reasons I'm not super active in social, I just found it in some ways to be kind of just kind of a bad place to be sometimes. You just go, why are these people just amplifying a message that really shouldn't be amplified? It's just they're complaining or whining or not standing up for themselves. You just go, I don't need to really hear this, and I don't want to perpetuate it. I don't want to contribute to supporting that if I'm just consuming the media and becoming an eyeball in some ad revenue model. Like I'm supporting the whole thing. So I've kind of taken my, I don't want to be the crotchety old guy, but at the end of the day, it's one of the reasons I've kind of taken away from that. But yeah, I agree. I mean, it's, what does it really take to live and to be happy? It certainly doesn't take a bright red Ferrari that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it helps. But it's certainly not needed. But I think it is an aspect of our wealth in general is what kind of in some ways ends up being a handicap for us in a big way too. So because you see other people that are living around the world, hand to mouth, and they're just happy as can be, and it just goes to show you don't really need a whole lot. I think early Americans didn't have a whole lot, but we have a lot now because of our wealth. So it changes the whole dynamic of our society and what we're actually trying to protect and things like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. It's interesting to see, but it's so disparate. I mean, we are so much wealthier than the rest of the world. From an economic and financial perspective. Again, even our poorest of poor are wealthier and do well. I mean, poor people living on the street, they're suffering and they're not doing well. I'm not trying to cut that short, but at the end of the day, most of us are just fabulously wealthy compared to other people in the world.
I think on an even crazier note, Josh, we had a 3% chance to be born in America.
Yeah.
And then like a 40% chance to be born in India.
Yeah.
And that's insane to me.
That's true. That's a good
insane
way to think about it. Yeah, exactly. Right. And that can be some very tough living, So they've got a disparate society as well too. There's a society that's got a full, not a formal caste system, but they did have a caste system where they had layers in it, and it's still very much alive, and it's not necessarily legal, but they still support those breakouts of their different culture, and some of them were kind of based on some not so great, qualifications for people, and this is a perfect example of some place that just doesn't do a great job of protecting its people, but that's their culture and what they're most worried about. So, but that's an interesting fact. Yeah. Like you do have to consider yourself blessed and pretty lucky to be here, rolling around in a beautiful day and a sunny day and a nice car. That just doesn't happen very often. So
does not. Yeah, very blessed.
Yeah.
So I want to hit on emotional intelligence. It's what is this podcast is.
Yep.
The foundation, I guess, because if you take Josh 1 and Josh 2, and Josh 1, when he's under pressure, he's under stress, he yells, he screams, he lets people know that he's angry.
Yep.
He enjoys it. He likes the way that it makes him feel when he gets upset. But Josh 2 really wants to do that, but he knows that's not mature. He knows that's not a good foundation of a business. So did you always have that skill of being emotionally mature?
No, of course not. Like when I was younger, I certainly wasn't. You learn quickly. I think in a corporate environment, again, because they are so collaborative, you'll learn very quickly what works and doesn't work. I have definitely lost my temper at work. I've definitely yelled at people. I've definitely had people yell at me. I've definitely had those experiences, all regretfully. I look back at them and go, God, that was just such a piss poor way to handle that. Like you just go, that was dumb. But I've had those fights. But you do learn from them when you have them, because cooler heads prevail and you start to understand, why people got in that position, and you figure out ways to mitigate and prevent that from happening to begin with. usually through more communication, more collaboration, right? And the more you do that. So certainly was not, but it is another interesting thing that I'll bring up relative to the startups and these high risk individuals is that, to your point about that, for those personality types, the Josh one, who's kind of the aggressive, kind of ball buster, not necessarily that nice to people, driving. People who are kind of risk averse and high functioning also tend to gravitate toward that personality type. And what was interesting is that I think we were seeing it collectively in the startup culture is that they started getting labeled as brilliant jerks. And what ended up happening is they were really good at doing what they're doing, but they were dicks about it every time they did something. And you're just like, at the end of the day, and I think Netflix was actually pretty famous for this, where they basically said, we're purging all the brilliant jerks. We're just going to fire them. Like, yeah, they perform and they do a really good job, but they make everyone so miserable that it affects, this is our lives. This is what we do day after day. We can't be miserable day in and day out because somebody's screaming and yelling and keeping everything tense and being nasty about stuff. So at the end of the day, and I actually had one of my startups was actually run by a brilliant jerk, with a brutal CEO. Just everyone, there wasn't a week that went by that I wasn't sitting in a room with a crying girl. It was in fashion tech, so most of the people I work with were women, and they were just so mean to each other. And it was like, look, we know we're under high stress, we know we're a startup, we know we have limited resources, but it's just not an excuse to be mean to each other. And that was the first instance where I really actually saw it affect people, because I was always dealing with somebody who was literally crying in an office like, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know why she's so mad at me, I don't know why she treats me this way, I'm trying to do this, and I went the extra effort and I did all these other things, and you just realize it just isn't productive, because those people just shut down when they're treated that way and treated really poorly. So again, that was probably another example of that would never happen at a bigger company because there's so much process to manage what might happen there. It definitely can happen at a startup, but you have to watch and see, because those brilliant jerks can really ruin an entire culture. They can really ruin an entire goal process. They can ruin your strategy. But you really have to watch for that. And then you have to watch for it in yourself, of course, as well too, which I think is more what you're driving at. But yeah, I certainly wasn't when I was younger, more just because I was a little more shoot from the hip, and I didn't probably have I just didn't have the experience, to be perfectly honest. But I did notice at that company that I was just talking about, a few people would always remark about, how do you stay so calm? And I'm like, well, I'm not really calm. I'm actually losing my mind inside. But, I guess the fact that I would just sit there and kind of patiently ask a question or say, well, is this really going to help us? Or, and just do it. They were just, it baffled a lot of the people that I work with, because they realized that I was able to kind of respond to this like really negative pressure and do so in a pretty productive way. And I think that was something where I finally turned that corner and kind of learned that, and I've carried that on because I realized I'm such a strength, and people like being in meetings with me, they like working on projects with me, because they knew that I was going to be grounded, because they knew that I was going to be sound, and I wasn't going to fly off the handle and treat them poorly or call them a name or disparage their genetic lineage or something. Like I was gonna treat them really, really badly. So it is a critical skill set, and along with that, any level of empathy. So if you're empathetic and you can understand where somebody's coming from, to be honest, you can manipulate them, you can work with them, you can do all sorts of stuff when you really understand. And empathy is a powerful tool. It can be abused, but it was my point about the manipulation. But it is a very, very important skill. Take a second, take a beat to kind of go, I wonder what this person's really after. I wonder what makes them tick. I wonder what they really care about in this instance, why they have skin in the game, what they're really thinking about there. Just asking those few questions can really set yourself up to have a much better conversation with somebody, especially if it's a very tenuous or kind of aggressive conversation in that regard. So, yeah, but it's a really critical skill to develop. If I would say to anyone who's younger, your age, if they feel, and I know you've taken command of this and you're pretty proud of it yourself in terms of what you've been able to do. Wait till this
I was gonna say.
But for anybody who's up and coming and trying to get a handle on their career and move forward, emotional intelligence, learning some empathy, really, really good skill sets for just dealing with people. You ultimately end up getting what you want, so it's a really, really good skill set in that regard. But it's a really just great way to deal with people and work together. So I couldn't tout that enough as like a high point that people should really focus on very heavily.
I love what you said there about empathy, because that was huge for me. It sounds so basic, but when I would say something mean and it felt so good to do it, Josh, what I would do is I wouldn't throw things, I wouldn't hit people, but I would be passive aggressive, and my tone would be so condescending, and it felt so good to do. But eventually when I figured out it's not normal and I was
Right.
trying to fix it, just switching the roles. What if you said that mean thing to
Yeah.
me?
Right.
Oh, all of a
That's
sudden
it.
you
Just
know,
ask the
that's
question.
it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Chase brought this up too. Ask the question. It opens you up. Like you gotta just ask yourself a question. What does this actually feel like? What is this from this other person's perspective? Just that level set alone will bring you down and put you on a level with that person, and it changes the whole day. So it's good that you learn that early, because you'll end up using that over and over again. Because you're gonna run into other tough situations. You'll run into bosses that are tough. You run into competitors that are tough. You run into vendors. You run into anyone who's just, they're having a bad day. They're doing, you just don't know, right? You just go, okay, let's see what's going on here. And if you can break somebody down, I mean, it's a little personal point of pride is I love working with people, maybe a customer or a client that's got like a real tough person. They're real steely. They don't cough up anything. And before you know, at the end of the day, you've got them laughing, joking, because you've realized all right, this person's under some stress. They're handling this whole project on their own. They don't have a team on their side. Like, now I start to understand where they're coming from. They don't think I'm helping them out. They're trying to figure that stuff out. So you can really connect with people a lot better in that regard, and it's really pretty key. So yeah, it's definitely something to focus on in a big way.
You said earlier that because you're not, I think, a brilliant jerk, that
Yeah.
people want to work with you
Yeah.
because you're not like that. Josh, how do you stay so calm? Maybe there's a jerk watching this and because you don't know what you don't know. If you're
Yeah.
not self-aware that it's a problem, the problem's not going to change. But say there's a brilliant jerk out there watching this.
Yeah.
What should we tell them, Josh?
That's tough because people are not bound to change, too much. So they, a brilliant jerk's going to want to change. And the fact of the matter is that a brilliant jerk probably has been successful because they were a brilliant jerk, because they can alpha their way into a situation and bully their way through. It's hard to be like, you know what, you shouldn't do that, because they're going to go, well, I've been successful. So it's a little tough. There's a little personality type involved here too. Like there are alphas, there are betas, there are sigmas or thetas and whatever, like all this like popular designation of personality types. And some people are just going to be bound to be brilliant jerks, and they're going to always have that shorter fuse and do what they need to do. You can tell them as much as possible that, you get more bees with honey, but at the end of the day, they might not really buy it, and they might not really understand it. So they have to want it. They'd probably have to experience a catastrophic failure for them even to be open enough to kind of realize that it might have been something internal. And that's a bit of an awakening, and not everyone experiences that, and not everyone's got the kind of peace of mind. So what I'm trying to get at is you might run across these people. It's going to be very hard to convince them to be otherwise, so the only thing you can really do is do it yourself. You can form some protective abilities, by dealing with those protective jerks, like I was doing with this CEO founder that was just terrible. She was just brutally demanding, no regard for our personal space, no regard for, any of the effort we'd done. She did not buy us cupcakes. She did never an accolade. She just, nothing was ever good enough. And it was just this sour feeling from the second you walked into the office till the second you left, hours after the office closed, because you were doing all this extra work. At the end of the day, I even sat down with her once. I'm like, I was kind of point blank with her, like, why are you such a jerk? And she's like, I'm 34 years old. This is the way I am. It's the way I'm going to go. I've gotten to where I am based on doing this. This is what I'm going to operate. Now, the funny thing is, her board fired her. So it was her company. She started it, and her own board fired her because they were like, she's just tearing this place apart. She can't keep talent. I left. Another person left. She only had people working who were in their 20s. She had no adults, working at the company. And she just could not keep things going because it was such a kind of toxic place to work, that she ended up getting fired. Now, has she realized what happened? I don't know. I think she wrote a book about her experience and just, was like, I'm the best thing since sliced bread, and, she will just continue to do that. So be it, let her be. I'm not going to waste my time trying to chase and pursue that. But you do need to build your own defenses when you find and identify those people, to just go, okay, this might just be a brilliant jerk. Capitalize on it, because they probably do know something. They probably do know how to set goals and stick to them, and they probably are very good at doing that, and they probably know how to communicate effectively because they know what the goals are, and they got to get people moving, and they can manage. They just might be jerks about it, literally, but you can kind of find the things that are good about what they're doing and anchor yourself to some of those things. But you need to protect yourself from just not taking things personally from those people that are just like, what are you doing? And I can't believe you didn't do that. And be like, well, then you're not thinking about things properly, because we have other things that are considering. I have a life that I lead, that's a dumb thing to say to me. You can shut them down, you can get defensive around it, But you don't want to be defensive every time you're around that person, because that's a bad posture for you. It's a bad, again, Chase was kind of talking about this. You don't want to say no and say these statements and shut yourself down. You always want to be open to questions. And if you're always that person, even around the brilliant jerks, you know, they've got nowhere to go. They've got no recourse. They can yell and you just go, well, fine, see ya. You know, like, what are you going to do? Like, I'll drive home in my Ferrari and relax, you know, like, you mean nothing to me at the end of the day. So you got to put everything into perspective that way. It's tough when it's a boss, because then, of course, they can lord over you a little bit. But, you know, that's just the way it is. But
You hit on something great there, and you said you told her that you got defensive with her one time, and she said, no, I'm 34. This is who I am.
Yep.
Josh, that is so dangerous.
Yeah,
That
so
is
dangerous.
so
That's what I
dangerous.
thought. That was my immediate red flag. I quit that company twice. I quit, and I stayed. She convinced me to stay, and I stayed for another 6 months, and I quit the second time. That was, first of all, the only company I think I ever quit, because I just did not like being there, and I quit twice. That's how bad it was. But, you know, she kind of played. I think she was a little bit of a manipulator as well too. But you're exactly right. That was my first red signal where I'm like, you're 30. I'm like, first of all, you're only 34. That's not that old. You know, like, two, you got plenty of room to grow here. I doubt you know everything that you think you're going to know. And two, to just say in general, I mean, my CEO is a couple years older than me, and I guarantee he's, you know, would bring up, well, we're going to learn something new next week, and, you know, we're going to learn, and I'm going to do something different. Yeah, he's got a modus operandi that he's operating with, in a way in which he thinks about the world, and he's probably not going to be able to move too far from that, you know, and I are the same for me, but you got to have some flexibility. I mean, again, it's a collaborative, voluntary nature, any business that you're in. You've got to have some flexibility to it. So to go into it just being like my way or the highway, but depends on the industry. There's some people in finance that do really well with that. There's some people in some startups that do that. I think you see a lot of times, you see these like CEOs or psychopaths more often than not. You know, they are the people that are just, it's my way or the highway, because they do get things done. And sometimes that's regarded more importantly than doing it well, or doing it in a way in which is sustainable. Because sometimes you just need to do that. So sometimes they're the right people for the job. But, you know, again, you got to live your life. You know, like, I've never just been one to like bend over and bow over to any of that type of stuff. I just go, you know, I can do this somewhere else. Like, I know my worth. You know your center, you know your worth, you've got your empathy, you know, you can relate to people. You can find your center somewhere else. It's really not going to be a big deal. I think people tend to panic a little bit about, you know, losing a job or leaving a job. It's like, you'll be fine. You know, you're going to be you. No matter where you go, there you are. You're going to be okay. You know, you're going to be fine there. So, but yeah, it was an immediate red flag for me. I was just like, this is the type of person I'm dealing with. But it was also, you know, she exposed too much. You know, I now knew what I was dealing with. So I was like, well, now I can figure out how to manage around this. I know where she's going to fall short. I know where she's going to fall over. I knew that she, you know, people don't like being in the room with her, but they like being in the room with me. Well, that gives me a lot of power. If I'm trying to drive projects and move things forward, I can actually make that happen, and she can't. So now I'm actually more productive in her own company than she is, you know, because I actually have the ability to actually, you know, pull people together. I'm actually going to take this over this way. We'll go great away. So, you know, it's be smarter, you know, be smarter than those people who are inflexible, can't figure things out. You're always going to do a lot better than they will ultimately.
So you said you agree that that's dangerous. So what's the most fascinating thing that you've changed about yourself that you thought was permanent?
That's a good question. I have to think about that one a little bit. There definitely have been some things. Most things have been growth, you know, where like I was good at taking risks, but I wasn't good at assessing risks, so I got a little bit better at those things. But your question's more about things that I might not have done. I have to think about that one a little bit more, because that's a trickier one to answer, because I don't tend to think of them, you know, I don't tend to think of the things that I didn't think I was going to do in that regard. But let me pause on that. I'll continue to think on that. We'll keep going on it, but because that's a tricky one to answer. Definitely aspects of flexibility. I've definitely gotten way more fluid in my older age in terms of how I take my approach to things. I just don't get fired up anymore like I used to. Sometimes I would get an email from somebody and just be instantly like angry, almost like what you were talking, like what's this person talking? I can't believe this, you know. I get this whole diatribe in my head about how I'm gonna, like, you know, yell at them and do whatever, only to sit down with them and realize they're like, oh yeah, I just sent that because I had a question about something. You just go, oh god, you know, I'm like ranting and raving and driving myself crazy on the side over here, and I just shouldn't be doing that at all. I'm just wasting my own energy on something that I shouldn't be wasting my energy on. So stuff like that, you know, I definitely have gotten better at, and I guess I never really thought I would get better at that, you know, like I just always thought that was kind of who I was, a little quick trigger, quick fire type person. but I've definitely gotten better at that and gotten to a point where I'm like, I better ask a question here and see what's going on and see if I understand exactly what they're trying to get at. And maybe I'm not missing, or maybe I'm missing something that I shouldn't be worried about. So I used to be a lot more, shoot from the hip and a little more verbal that way. So that's definitely something that I've gotten a little bit better at for sure.
So you mentioned it way in the beginning, and I'm gonna bring it back up. And in our interview, the Grubhub story, that negotiation.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's incredible to me. So for those who don't know, what happened?
So I was working for campusfood.com. We were an online food ordering for college campuses. We went nationwide. We were doing very, very well, and we technically merged with Grubhub. And as everyone probably aware now, Grubhub now a big national brand. They went public and did everything else. And when we initially merged with them, it was fairly uneasy for us because we were technically bought by them, but it was called a merger. And at the end of the day, we were still a small team, and we, these bigger guys kind of came in from Chicago. We were in New York, and they're like, "Yay, we're all merging and great." And our whole company was very like, "Yeah, I guess. Like, is this good or bad, or is this whatever?" So as they assimilated us, and they did a fantastic job of this actually. As they assimilated the workforce and brought us in, they basically tried to I think they kind of read the room and realized that people were actually a lot more anxious about this and not as, they thought it was a very good thing, but most of the people in the company treated it as though it was almost like a hostile takeover, and it really wasn't. And they read that very well, to their credit. And they tried to make things as copacetic as possible, just as easy. This was your job before, this is your job today, same title, same pay, no changes. You just now report to this person at a different level. Here's the things, your daily tasks are the same, everything is great. And I looked at it as an opportunity because I think I understood a little bit more like, well, wait, this big company's coming in and buying us. And, when you start to see mergers in a space like that, it's usually because they're going to go public and they're going to do, like something's going on. They raise some money to buy competitors, and that's exactly what, ended up happening there. You go, there's an opportunity to be had here. There's a way to step up. And I think my ability to recognize that was really key. And the story that I told you, which I'll share with the viewers here, was I walked into that room and they gave me the paperwork and I said, yeah, that's all fine. And they did the same thing. This is your title. It's the same job. It's the same pay. And I actually I didn't shove it back, but I kind of set it back and said, are there actually better opportunities? I was actually hoping for something that would be, a bigger step up within your organization. Or are there other roles that I could work into that my skill set might do that might be either higher pay or a little bit more management or something like that? And I tell you, the way in which the HR person responded was my instant signal. She just quickly grabbed all the paperwork and she's like, that's awesome. She's like, I'm going to go back. I will talk to the tech guy. There are plenty of roles that you can move into. She's like, no one else said this to us. We're super excited to have this. I mean, just the excitement on her face and just the fact that she just like grabbed all the paperwork. It's like, yeah, we're going to find something. And they came back to me in a week with a job that was much better. It was a little bit higher up. It was part of their kind of product management org, and I wasn't really quite a product manager yet. I was a little on the junior side, which was still fine. Working with a really bright group of people, and all the counterparts were like really, really cool. And it was like, this is fantastic. This is so much better had I said something, but I positioned it as, I'd like to seek a better opportunity in your org. I want something with some more responsibility, more accountability. I'm not afraid of, taking on this new role or this new task. And they just jumped at it. They were so happy that I had taken that on because I read the room and I understood that they were seeing this as a collection of minds and us all moving forward on this bigger trajectory. I didn't know what their trajectory was, but I could tell there was something big they were going for. And it really just paid off well. And it was one of the bigger jumps in my career that I did. One, because I ended up working for Grubhub, which is great to have that on your resume. But two, it just really worked me up in that organization. I didn't end up staying with them that long, but I was able to see them go through when they did go public, which was super fun, to be part of that. I didn't make a lot off that because I was, late to the game, and they bought us already, and we made our money on the merger that way, which wasn't much to be had at that point. But it was still just a really fun thing to go through and to be a part of. And again, to their credit, they did a very good job of kind of pulling us in and had a great set of plans for adopting us and pulling us in that way. So it was really kind of interesting in that regard. But by taking that initiative, by just being like, hey, let me ask you a few more questions before I sign on the dotted line. Let me show some ambition. Let me show a little thing. They could have just said, no, sorry, this is it. Take it or leave it. And I would have said, okay, fine, I'll sign on the dotted line. And that would have been okay. But that would have been the worst that happened. What were they going to say? No, you're fired? No, of course not. They already had the plan to assimilate us and they were already pulling us over. floor. You can only go up from there, so you don't get what you don't ask for. So, which is something I've learned from my wife more than anything else. But you don't get what you don't ask for. So go in and ask, put it out there and just say, call that out, realize what you're worth, and say, there's probably a better opportunity. I don't know where they are. Can you tell me where they are, and can you put me there? And they said, absolutely. And that's exactly what they did. And it was really fantastic. It really worked out really well. It was a big pivotal point in my career. Just asking that question, in that time.
The biggest or one of the biggest?
One of the biggest, I think, because it was a big jump from a salary perspective. I think it was the first time I'd moved into like six figures. So I was like, it was a momentous like movement. My position had changed to an actual title. I forget what it was, like a senior agile project manager. And that was pretty much a product manager, but it was a really good title in a really good company. And the pay was really good, and everything increased there. It really jumped me out. I had also been at the previous company for like 9 years, so I was pretty stagnant there for a while, and I didn't want to keep doing the same thing I've been doing for the last 9 years. I was like, I got to do something more here. We're under an acquisition. This is a big change, a big event. Maybe there's something else to take on here. And it ended up being a good thing to do that way. So it was definitely one of the bigger jumps. And then, of course, just being in their organization, having that on my resume has kind of increased and stepped up everything else. It is important to have those big names on your resume because it shows that you can work in those companies and they're big successes, and people just go, well, if they're a big success and you're worked at that company, you must be a big success too. Of course, it's not always the case, but they give you the benefit of the doubt. So it was definitely one of the, if not one of the bigger moves I did just by asking a couple questions. It was really, really key.
You and I both do that because the amount, I asked for your number. I asked for this opportunity, and you either say yes or you say no.
What am I
and
gonna say,
that's the worst that's gonna happen.
Right.
But I feel so many people feel like, oh, the earth is gonna explode.
Yeah,
they only think of the negative, or
I'll look funny, or so worried about that, or people may think I'm gauche for asking something, or it's a big fuck. Just ask. It's funny. My wife lives by this mantra, and she traditionally always worked for very high net worth individuals, and she learned it from her boss. She was supporting the whole family of high net worth individuals, and this is a woman who had tons of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, and she would just ask for stuff. She didn't, not that she couldn't afford it or whatever. She would just ask, and sometimes people would say no, and she'd say fine, but she's like, always ask. And she kind of trained that within Jen, and Jen learned that. So now Jen's just a perfect example of that, and then I learned it from her. It's like, just ask, because the worst I say is, no, sorry, I can't do that. Okay, thanks, I've tried. It's fine. And at the end of the day, at least you gave it a shot, so it's good. But yeah, it's what's gonna happen? Somebody's pride's gonna be broken. I'm like, nobody cares. Nobody's gonna remember the conversation 2 months from now. Like, it just doesn't matter. So, but there are introverts that think it does. But but at the end of the day, nobody really cares. But yeah, it's a key point.
Are there other times or other opportunities where you've done that and you've reaped the benefits of doing that?
Yeah, I think. It's funny. Since then, that was probably the one big pivotal moment where I really pushed hard on that one. My later jobs and even my current position were actually a little more luck-based. I was a little more passive in some of those. I was in between jobs, and I was really taking my time finding a new position. And this company that ultimately hired me, which was an offshoot of Two Sigma, which was a large hedge fund in the city, kind of came after me, and I was actually very passive about it. I let them drive the entire thing, and I didn't actually push that a whole lot. And they ended up being way above my expectations in terms of what they were going to offer me. So it was actually, in some ways, it was good that I didn't ask questions, because not to counteract what I just said, because I think it's really important to ask the questions and do that. But had I opened my mouth and asked for something dumb, I would have been one of those things like, will you pay me $10? And I'm like, we're planning on paying you $100. Like, it was one of those things where I was like, oh, okay, so you guys are really kind of a big deal. So in some ways, you gotta be smart about it to some extent. But I think, at the end of the day, it never err on the side of, like, if you don't know something, just ask a question. Nobody's going to really care. But I don't think there's any other big times that I can think of like that. But that seemed to be for me, because it was just a pivotal moment. I think it was more the environment as well too. You have to be aware of that from the environment. It was a merger, bigger company coming in, taking a smaller company. Things were going to change. Like, you can't just sit there and be like, and the rest of my coworkers were just thinking everything's going to be status quo. It's like, it can't be status quo. This is the nature of two companies coming together is a machination and a whole merger of things going on, and ideologies and political cultures within the companies and stuff like that. It's just, it can't be the same after this. So you might as well take command of what it's going to look like, look for those opportunities, and when you see those disruptions, you're far better off driving in and driving that wedge and driving yourself through, versus the places where this looks like it's pretty easy peasy. Maybe just go with the flow a little bit. But to say you're right all the time is impossible, right? You never know. But yeah, I think in that instance, I was just like, this is upheaval. This is going to be different. I can either be in the surf, being splashed around by the waves, or I can be charging through the ocean and forcing my way through it. And that's what I chose to do. And in that instance, it paid off very, very well. So, and I would say anyone else who's dealing with that, you're dealing with some churn. You're dealing with some churn. You're dealing with, like, you got another job doing the status quo, and at the Cheesecake Factory, and you're like, nah, this isn't, I need something else. And what did you do? You forged ahead, you drove the thing, you parted the sea, and you did the thing that you needed to do. Because you're like, I could just keep doing the same thing over and over again and work at another company doing the same thing again. No, you're like, it's got to be different. And when you recognize those opportunities in your life, I don't think they come along that often, to be perfectly honest. So when you get them, you got to seize on them and really have to capitalize on them pretty quickly. So I think the fact that you noticed it, the fact that I noticed it, is kind of key to the fact that we have success, and the success that we do have is got to be driven by our ability to identify those types of scenarios and go, whoop, now's the time to drive in and actually make this my own. I'm going to make it my way, and make sure that makes sense. Ask the right questions, push this, take advantage of the opportunity, and move through it that way. So, yeah.
I asked you a similar question in the beginning, but what are some traits or characteristics that, for lack of a better term, make somebody more likely to be successful than somebody else?
That's a tough one, because I think people, I'd actually hesitate to say it's this characteristic or another characteristic, because I think people find success with a great blend of characteristics. Yes, of course, people that are, people who are self-learners are going to be successful, because they're always going to go, what do I not know? Teach myself something, and they're going to make a better decision, right? So self-learning, self-education, whatever that ends up being, whether you're pursuing formal education, or whether you're, just learning something on your own or taking some classes, those people tend to do a lot better, I find, in life. There are people who are very successful who don't take any risks. You can be very successful not taking risks because you don't lose anything, right? It's just hard to get like high upside, but it doesn't mean that you're not necessarily successful. I think you have to look at the measure of what outcome you're trying to go for to really determine whether or not somebody's, quote unquote, successful or not. If somebody wants, a steady life with a family and whatever they want to be, and that's what they're going for, that's the outcome that they're trying to do, there are a lot of people that are very successful at that, So at the end of the day, they are not risk takers, and they are not this, that, and the other thing. So unless we're like directly classifying success as you have to have a lot of money or drive a Ferrari or drive a Lamborghini, like, chasing myself, that's different. But so you have to temper that, you have to temper the question a little bit in terms of what you're actually saying, because there's a lot of different means of success, to hit those goals and do all that stuff. So it's tough to say one thing or another. But for people like us in general, somebody's gonna roll in that Lamborghini.
Wow.
There we go.
Wow.
That's pretty. But it's definitely gonna have to be a hunger. It's definitely gonna have to have that insatiable ambition. Ambition is a hunger that you have to have, and it's hard to satiate. Some people it's very easy to satiate. Those people probably won't be highly successful. You got to be somebody who's kind of always constantly a little hungry. You don't want to be hungry forever, but you need to have a little hunger, and that's going to show. The emotional intelligence is just a big deal in general. Self-learning, emotional intelligence, kind of an insatiable appetite for ambition. Those are the things that you're going to see drive people. You definitely certainly need some grit and determination, but I've seen people with grit and determination fail miserably, just keep grinding, bro. And it's like, unless you're really paying attention, this is actually part of some of the things I wanted to bring up with you today too, is a little bit of a mental model for how you actually measure goals, measure your outcome, and drive your strategies. Strategy is not just grinding your face against the pavement. That's not going to work. It sounds good, and it's just grind it out, bro. And you see a lot of this in social media and a lot of our culture today. But you have to be a little more intelligent than that. It's a little more nuanced to actually see the success that you want to see to make those things happen. But yeah. So but those core traits, I think, are kind of the bare minimums that I think you need to be to see successful to some extent to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. So, I fully believe that any skill you have or don't have can be developed, like with me in anger.
Mm-hmm.
What would be a path to develop a risk tolerance?
That's probably probably easier. I was gonna say that's a really hard question, and then I immediately changed my mind. I was like, no, it's actually probably pretty easy. I think Chase talked about this a little bit too. And besides getting outside of your comfort zone was kind of his theme in general. Like what it's kind of funny because the one thing that Chase was saying that I was something I would actually never do. Like I consider myself pretty risk averse, but I would never just go buy an outrageous car like this that I couldn't afford to force myself to get into it. Like I was actually pretty conservative on this car. Like I had the money. I was like I borrowed a little bit. Everything was fine. When I did this. And I was really surprised to hear him say that. And I think he talked to somebody else as well. My wife said she listened to one of the other podcasts, kind of said the same thing. But it's just doing that a little bit. It's hard to do, but take something that is an actual risk and just try it out. There's small risks that you can do every day. Try a new flavor of something. Try a new dinner.
Wow.
Like little things like that will start to build up where you realize, gee, I always get the same thing every day at this thing. I'm just going to try something different. You might find that you really like it. I don't know. It's kind of a hokey, anecdotal way to look at it. But at the end of the day, just these little tiny steps will start to show that, one, these small risk changes won't result in something catastrophic. What's the worst that's going to happen? I get a flavor of something that I don't really like, and tomorrow I get that flavor back again. Okay, fine. Nothing really lost. But try those little things and those little changes in your life. Try to analyze the things that are making you super comfortable and see what kind of edges or boundaries you can push on those things. You don't have to make monumental life changes like, buying a Lamborghini or something. I mean, it would certainly work and certainly motivate you to have to work your ass off to kind of cover that. But boy, I'm sure most people are not willing to do that or not willing to take that risk. But you can always start very small with it and then start to build that risk tolerance a little bit to understand that there's a good way. But to be honest, to really understand your risk tolerance and to be successful with it, you have to be able to make a risk that you're going to fail at. You won't learn unless you fail. So you're going to have to push something. You can't play it safe all the time and expect your risk tolerance or your ability to manage risk to grow or get better if you're just always taking the safe bet, the slightly different flavor. That's not going to work too well. But just starting a little bit there is definitely going to be helpful to some extent.
Gosh, I think, in my opinion, that's the most fascinating thing you said, because I was going to ask you, okay, so how do you start doing those risks? But You're right. When I go to Chick-fil-A, I get the same thing every time because I know it's so good. But taking a risk and trying something new, that's like the most bare bones. Yeah.
And go, oh, this is pretty damn good. And go, I threw a dart and it's pretty damn good. Or you hate it. You go, well, I hate it, but it's still, what's the end of the world? Like, I'll get a better sandwich tomorrow. So, I think people can just do that a little more often, get out of their routines a little bit. Try new food, try something else, go to a neighborhood you've never done, go to a different bar. There's lots of things you can do that just start to kind of shell you out of that comfort zone. Those are easy, small tasks to do. And then once you start to kind of train your body that those things are kind of okay, then you can open up for other tasks and other bigger asks in that way. So, yeah.
You talked about early on being a programmer. So is that specifically coding?
Yeah, that was specifically coding. Yeah. So when I first started, I have a degree in economics, which is a good degree. I would recommend to anyone. But at the end of the day, you either work in finance or you work in finance. And I didn't necessarily want to work in finance. Not that you can't make a lot of money in finance to be successful. I just didn't, I don't know, I just wasn't into that culture, and I didn't find it that interesting. So I went back and I took a webmaster certification course, and it taught me HTML and JavaScript, and it taught me some basic software design tools. It was a 6-month course. My parents paid for it, with their blessing, because they were like, you got to do something, because I was working in a shoe store. And I took that, and then just parlayed those skills, and I learned like 3 or 4 different computer languages. I got really good with SQL and database design. That was just very particularly well suited toward the way I think about the world. It's spatial thinking, and I'm a really strong spatial thinker. And when you think about databases, you have to be able to kind of visualize the data in kind of a 3-dimension. Some people can do that, some people can't. It's kind of left brain, right brain type stuff. And it just worked very well for me. So I was also very good at languages. I took a lot of languages. I took Spanish, I took French, I took Polish, I took Chinese, and computer languages are just languages. So there's syntax and grammar and, the way in which they're written. So that all came very naturally to me. So I actually did do a fair amount of, front-end programming, front-end design work, and front-end HTML and CSS coding in my early career, and built those things. So it was something just kind of, again, played on my strengths, where I was like, oh, this is good, this clicks. And when something clicks like that, if you can take advantage of it and put some money in your pocket because of it, then you're obviously, that's what everyone's trying to do with their career, right? What is the thing that I'm good at, find the thing that I can do that I'm good at, and then try to get myself paid based on that. So so it worked out pretty well, and in some ways I probably got very lucky at that, doing those things, but it was, they just kind of snowballed into each other from there. And then then I started going, well, I'm not an engineer, I clearly couldn't do the work as well as the engineers, who are people who have computer science degrees, but so there was a limit to what I could do, and I was jokingly the guy that knew enough to be dangerous. So they were like, yeah, we can let you into the code, but don't break anything, because I was the guy who constantly breaking things, because I just didn't know enough to do that. And finally I hung up my spurs and stopped doing the coding and just started working on, maybe I'll focus on what problem we're trying to solve and why we're solving the problem, and you guys can figure out the how to build the problem or how to solve the problem, because you guys are far better at doing that than I am, because I'm just kind of a self-taught junkie when it came to coding and stuff. But yeah, I did do a lot of coding, which now you don't have to do today. You can kind of use AI. It's kind of unbelievable. I almost want to get back, because I kind of know the concepts and just use these like new tools to kind of figure that stuff out. So but yeah, the sky's the limit now. But at the time, it was still a really strong skill set. Just to be able to code knowing languages was really pretty important.
Oh yeah, the dot-com boom.
Yeah.
From what I've heard, people were skeptical about it, like almost like AI, like, okay, yeah, I know, yeah, it's okay, you think it's crazy, it's not gonna do everything, but the people who,
what's email?
Yeah, exactly. Like the people who took advantage of that reap the benefits. So you experienced it firsthand. What was that like?
It was wild, because it really was Wild West. You really did feel, I mean, this is a time like and I'm in this generation that was without email. Like I got an email while I was in college, because it was like, it was like my second year in college, and they're like, everyone gets an email now, and we're like, what's email? So I mean, I didn't grow up with computer systems, and I didn't grow up playing, I played some video games, and that was about it. But I didn't do any of that. Like the internet hit as I was kind of an adult already, right? So I was already kind of learning this. So it was virgin territory, and it was really kind of mind-numbing to get your head around what was going on. You're like, there's a computer somewhere, and another computer talks to it, and then you can send it money, and then it'll send you products, and you're like, how does that work? You're just like, what? It's not real. Like, there's nothing. How do we actually make this happen? So it was a pretty wild time, because it was so existentially different than anything we had known. But there was also, when you started getting into it, you were like, I'm part of something really special here. This is a big deal. This is big money. But the dot-com bubble burst. It was the same thing, where it was super, super hot, lots of VC money. My first company was one of those companies. We got $30 million from Parmalat, and then Parmalat went belly up, and like everything else went belly up. We went out of business. We had like 2 6-month bridge fundings that were paying our paychecks, and then my CEO came in and just said, we're done. We just don't have enough money to operate. Like, we're going to have to shut down the business, and we're finished, and that's it. So it was and that was everywhere in the whole dot-com boom. And then there was like kind of the second dot-com boom, and then I've seen every trend under the sun. That's why I also tend to take a little a little pessimistic lens. Even with AI, I'm like, AI's cool. I can see the regard here. There's gonna be a lot of churn. There's gonna be a lot of like startup things. There's gonna be new chatbots. They're gonna come in. They're gonna go out. They're gonna disappear. There's gonna be a few big winners. The third guy that comes in is probably gonna be the big guy. Not the first guy. And sure enough, you're starting to see all that play out again too. History certainly rhymes. Like it's definitely the type of thing where you see that. Things are moving at a much more accelerated pace, I would say, than they have been. So that's the only thing. Like it was still pretty. At the end of the day, it was still pretty. It was business as usual, even though it was new technology and new tech stacks and things like that. But it's now things are moving at a rapid pace. AI is really interesting in terms of what it's doing and how fast it is. It's also interesting in how bad it is sometimes, which we run into a lot as well. It makes mistakes like you'd never believe. You just go, this is crazy. But yeah, so but it is moving faster. But being part of the first time around was interesting. But to say that the dot-com boom was the first time wasn't. There was a industrial revolution before that. There were new modernizations that occurred before that. They just didn't quite have as big an impact, and we're just seeing amplifications now. But we're like I said, history rhymes. It just you see the same things over and over again. So I see a lot of that same stuff today. So and the same fervor and the same interest there.
So also in the beginning, you talked about how there's so much risk in placing bets on startups. Mm-hmm. Is there, from all the startups you've placed bets on and everything you've seen, is there a somewhat common theme of a successful startup?
Hey guys, It's Joey. You're probably wondering why I'm interrupting the podcast right now. And to be transparent, the camera died in the middle of us filming. But don't worry, because we do have part 2 coming. And we're going to talk about topics that we haven't even touched on yet and dive deeper into ones that we just talked about. I'm looking forward to part 2. I hope you guys are as well. I will see you guys then.